Well, good evening, everybody. I'm not quite sure which evening it is, but good evening. As the rabbi has just said, I'm on my way to Australia, and I'm reliably informed that I abolished Thursday altogether. So this is a bit perplexing, but I'm really delighted to be here in California, in LA. I've been here for 3 days. I've met some really great people. And it is wonderful to be among so many people who are of like minds. I'm very grateful to this shul for inviting me to speak to you this evening. So I've been invited to speak about East versus West, the New World Order. And I mean, you know, there are events, recent events are very much on our minds, the recent terrible events. The Paris massacres, then what happened in Copenhagen just a few days ago. The free world, we can all see, is under attack by Islamist terrorists who wanted to destroy the West and indeed to make the world Islamic, including the Islamic world more Islamic. So this is a clear and present danger to us all, but in my view, the danger to us is made all the more acute. Because the West, I think, is unable to think clearly about this threat. It's reluctant to identify correctly that it stems from religious fanaticism, from a particular interpretation of Islam. Now, that does not mean that all Muslims subscribe to this particular interpretation of their religion. On the contrary, the most numerous victims around the world of this interpretation of their religion are actually Muslims themselves. But it is, in my view, worse than idle to pretend that it is not rooted in religious sources, in Islamic religious sources, when so many disparate groups emerging out of widely different conflict zones around the world all exhibit very similar behavior and justify the barbarism that they exhibit by explicitly quoting verses from Islamic holy texts. They define themselves as Islamic. They say that they are doing what they're doing in the name of the religion. And yet our politicians in the West are going to enormous lengths, like comic lengths, to say that Islamic terror has nothing to do with Islam. Monsieur Hollande said it after the Paris massacres. He said this has got nothing to do with Islam. Our Prime Minister in Britain, David Cameron, said after Islamic State started beheading Western hostages that no religion could possibly sanction such activity. And President Obama says after every massacre by Islamic terrorists, this has got nothing to do with Islam. Now, not only does the West not identify this threat correctly, but it responds to terrorist outrages or Islamic intimidation by blaming the victim. After the slaughter at the Charlie Hebdo magazine, the cartoonists were blamed. It was said that it was their fault that they had deliberately drawn cartoons which were so which mocked Islam. And any criticism of Islam or Islamic terror is said to be Islamophobia. In other words, we can't criticize Islam without ourselves being accused of bigotry. Now, I believe that this upside-down way of thinking is part of a wider and deeper confusion that has attacked our culture from within and made it particularly vulnerable to attack from without. It's a refusal to join up the dots and see this for the civilizational challenge that it is. It's an attempt that we're facing to reconstruct an empire, an Islamic empire, and destroy the liberal Western nation-state that embodies democracy, freedom, and modernity. The danger is hugely increased, in my view, by the fact that the nation-state is in danger, and democracy and modernity with it, as a result of our own inability to see things for what they really are. Now, we're living through a time of enormous global upheaval, of which the chaos and barbarism coming out of the Islamic world are symptoms. The detonator, I would suggest, was the fall of communism. We were told when communism fell, when the Berlin Wall fell, we were told by the writer Francis Fukuyama that this was the end of history. Remember that phrase? The end of history, that democracy had won. that the fall of communism meant that freedom and democracy was now being enshrined across the world. And we can all see now that this was very far from the truth. Indeed, I believe that Francis Fukuyama eventually disavowed his own theory. Now, one might say, on the contrary, that with the end of empire and colonialism, and with the collapse of communism, the genie of democracy that was let out of the bottle has, in many respects, bred only monsters. That's a terrible thing, but I think that is indeed what has happened. Look at what's happened. Communism fell, the Berlin Wall fell, but it was replaced by an authoritarian Russian nationalist secular Tsar, Vladimir Putin. The Soviet power apparatus has remained largely in place in the former Soviet Union, and we can all see that Mr. Putin is trying to put the Soviet Empire back together again. That's why he has stamped all over Crimea, Georgia, and eastern Ukraine. We can look at the Eurasian Economic Union, comprising Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and I think from May, Kyrgyzstan, sorry about my pronunciation, looking somewhat similar in terms of a putative empire. But as other analysts have commented, for all that we are frightened silly by the threat from Russia, Russia is a kind of zombie empire, a half-dead empire, or a half-dead polity that can still cause serious misery for its neighbours and mischief for people in Europe, but is nonetheless a tottering, a weak state. It can seize the Crimea, but it may not be able to prevent China sometime in the future from seizing the underpopulated Russian Far East. So bad as Russia is, Russia's kind of looking over its shoulder at another putative empire rising in the east, China. Now, China is very different from Russia, but it operates kind of in tandem with Russia against the mutual enemy of Western dominance. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that primarily brings together Russia, China, and several Central Asian former Soviet republics, has co-opted in turn countries such as India, Iran, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and North Korea. China is spreading its interests in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. And just to complete this disturbing and dismaying geopolitical picture, we see Turkey, a former pivot of Western defences, now under Mr. Erdogan, part of the hostile anti-West alliance. So that's what's going on in Europe. What about the Arab and Muslim world? Well, how did the fall of communism play out there? Well, what we had there was the so-called Arab Spring, which was, you may well recall, hailed as a brave new world of freedom. Why was it hailed as a brave new world of freedom? Well, this may sound rather callow, but I think this is basically what happened. People looked at the people on the streets in the Arab world protesting, saw that they were wearing jeans and were on Twitter and on Facebook, and decided therefore they were Democrats. In fact, as some of us rather sourly observed from the get-go, what we thought would happen did happen, and the people who really had the power, the Islamists, took over in these countries. And so what we have instead is not a brave new world of Arab democracy, but chaos, barbarism, and intra-tribal civil war all over the place. And this is because there's this great fallacy about democracy, which I'm afraid in the past American presidents, such as President Bush, got so terribly wrong. There's this fallacy that if you have elections, then you have democracy. Well, elections are the very last piece of the democratic puzzle. Britain, which in fact invented, I would suggest, controversially, invented liberty. Elections are the last piece of the puzzle. You have to cement into a society the institutions of a free society, a free press, a free judiciary, an uncorrupt police service, and so on, before you can get to the final piece of the puzzle, which is elections. Otherwise, you end up electing tyrants. But unfortunately, the institutions of a free society are not in place in the Arab world. So instead of democracy, instead of democratic nation states in the Arab world, we see now, happening before our eyes, a breakdown of the very notion of nation states, which was imposed artificially on tribal Arab worlds after World War I. We're witnessing the disintegration of nations such as Syria and Iraq, artificially created nations. We're witnessing their disintegration and reversion, as far as we can see what's happening, to tribal enclaves. It's very likely that Syria, Iraq, maybe other Arab countries are going to break up into tribes. And so you have conflicts within and between states, between ethnic and religious groups. And instead of democracy, you have the Islamists coming to power in the Arab world. Where does that leave Israel, incidentally? That creates a much more complicated picture for Israel, because when Arabs fight among themselves, it's good for Israel, but of course, with this kind of chaos, you have an increased threat of rogue actors, which threaten Israel even more seriously. And this produces also great dangers to the West, because the success of the Islamists breeds further radicalization. So the very fact that Islamic State has set up a government in northern Iraq, proclaimed a caliphate, is itself a source of radicalization. It galvanizes vulnerable Muslims around the world, particularly young Muslims, to think that one more push and we can actually overturn the whole of the West. So that's what's going on in the Arab world. You've got tribes, tribalism instead of nation, and in terms of Europe, you have the rise of Russia and then China as potential empires. Now, bad as these problems are, they're made much worse by the collapse of the idea of a nation in the West as well. Because after the Second World War, what basically happened was that there was an erosion of belief in the nation. The nation caused nationalism, nationalism led to war. If you wanted to avoid Nazism happening again in Europe, you had to get rid of the nation. And consequently, therefore, you had the European Union, which was an erosion of the idea of the nation. And I think what happened also after the Second World War was a kind of demoralization, a collapse of belief in progress, modernity, and high culture, because Germany was supposed to be the very acme of all those things. And so in Britain, you had something even worse, which was a collapse of the empire and a collapse of its power in the world, which created even greater demoralization. Now, as a result of this demoralization of the elites in Britain, you had basically a gradual collapse of the fundamental moral and cultural codes of the country. Instead of biblically based morality, you had rising instead a belief in radical egalitarianism, lifestyle choice, the belief that no culture could be superior to any other culture, no lifestyle could be superior to any other lifestyle. I choose my lifestyle. Nobody has a right to tell me that my lifestyle is wrong. My culture can't be superior to other cultures because that is a form of racism, is looking down on other people. And the West in particular couldn't say that its culture was better than any other, because the West was identified with original sin, otherwise known as empire or colonialism. So the West was responsible for having oppressed the nations of the Third World. Instead of nation, instead of Western nation being good, you had instead the rise of the idea that multiculturalism was good, that there should be no distinction made between cultures, because multiculturalism doesn't just mean being nice to other cultures, being tolerant of other societies and other cultures and minorities. That's good, I mean, that's what we should all be doing. Multiculturalism is a very specific doctrine which says no culture should say it's any better than any other. And of course, it follows from that. You can't say a liberal culture is better than an illiberal culture. You can't say that in the West we believe, for example, in equality for women, and therefore we look down on cultures which don't have equality for women. We think they're worse. No, you can't say that in a multicultural society. That's racist. That's racist, because you can't say that the West is any better. And so we had this doctrine of multiculturalism. And we also had the rise of the doctrine known as transnational progressivism, which basically means that because the nation is a bad thing, because nations lead to nationalism, nationalism leads to war, what you should have instead is transnationalism. That is to say, a kind of brotherhood of man mentality in which we all cooperate as nations together. So instead of nations having a particular set of laws which exclude others, you have the rise of transnational institutions which put into place international laws and instruments. And therefore that's better, because that means you erase, almost by definition, you erase the distinction between nations, between cultures. And therefore it's going to produce peace on earth, isn't it? Because you're all the brotherhood of man. So transnational institutions such as the sainted UN, the sainted International Criminal Court, the sainted European Court of Justice, and all those other transnational, supranational institutions, they're all good. They're all really good. And international law is really, really good because it's international, as opposed to your own particular laws, which are by definition rooted in your particular culture and therefore basically racist. So you had this transnational progressive belief, the belief in international law, and the belief in the United Nations. The United Nations is the principal institution representing and embodying the brotherhood of man. It's where nations come together, and instead of fighting each other, it basically organizes for peace and justice in the world. So that was the sort of set of beliefs based on egalitarianism. And as a result of this, various other things followed. It created a kind of victim class of groups or nations which were held to be victims of the powerful, either within a society or the society was powerful. Either white people within a society were powerful or Western nations were powerful. And so ethnic minorities within white society were minority groups. They were basically victims because they weren't powerful, and third world countries were victims of Western countries which were powerful. So the powerless and the powerful became the kind of paradigm way of looking at the world, and the powerless were held to be not responsible for their own behavior. They were the victims of circumstance, therefore they could not be held responsible for their own behavior. They weren't free actors. They were the victims of powerful people, i.e. the victims of the West. And so whatever they did, they couldn't be held responsible, they couldn't be blamed for it. So if they did really, really, really bad things, you couldn't say that they were responsible for bad things. You couldn't say they were bad people because they were ethnic minorities and they were victims of you. And so it had to be your fault, because you'd made them victims in the first place. And so you were responsible for their behavior. And so if they killed you, it was your fault. And that's why in Britain, and I kid you not, the day after 9/11, the day of 9/11, Britain said, America had it coming to it. America had it coming to it. In fact, the American ambassador to Britain was reduced to tears on a television program that week by people saying precisely that. So the result of all this is this, that if you don't really believe in yourself as a nation anymore, and particularly as a Western nation for all these reasons that I've given, then it follows that you don't believe that war is something that you do, because war is barbaric, and you shouldn't go to war to defend yourself because you're really not worth defending. So war is something that's reserved for people who aren't like us. Okay, so if you have a third world country which is by definition oppressed, and if it chooses to go to war, well, that's okay. But you don't go to war because that's kind of barbaric, and we're kind of beyond that now, because we do international law, we do the brotherhood of man, we are civilized, we are Western, we believe in reason. And war is an atavistic, barbaric thing which doesn't have any place in our nice, sanitized, reason-dependent world. And so, because we're clever, because we're Western, because we're superior, we don't do war anymore. We do something called soft power. Instead of war, we do law. Instead of fighting and killing people, we sit them down in a room and we give them tea and cake, and we do negotiation. We do peace processes. We do conflict resolution. Only knuckle-dragging troglodytes do conflict. We do conflict resolution because we are the West. And so it becomes almost inescapable. You cannot do war. War is a bad thing. You must not kill people. Killing people is so stupid. How many times am I hearing at the moment? War solves nothing. War solves nothing? Really? What, not ever? No, not ever. There is nothing worse than killing people. If you kill people, that is so stupid. You have to do conflict resolution instead. War solves nothing. War solves nothing, so what happened in 1939 then? Because when people said war solves nothing in the 1930s, some of us, if we were around at the time, which I wasn't, but if you know what I mean, some of us said that's appeasement. Because if you have a non-negotiable agenda, such as was held by the Nazi Party, you cannot negotiate with a non-negotiable agenda. Negotiating with a non-negotiable agenda is otherwise known as surrender, a word which has gone out of fashion along with war. However, if you really do believe that you don't do war anymore, you do law, and that you have to negotiate because everyone is governed by reason and self-interest, and you have to do conflict resolution, then you have to refuse to accept that there are some agendas which are non-negotiable, because that means if you accept that some agendas are non-negotiable, then there's no other way to defeat that agenda except to defeat it by waging war upon it. And because war has become unthinkable in the West, because that's barbaric and we're all civilized, it follows that we have to redefine the non-negotiable agenda as a negotiable agenda. We have to reframe the narrative to fit the idea that everything is negotiable. In other words, we have to tell lies to ourselves about the threat that is being faced. And that is precisely what we've been doing. And so we refuse to accept sometimes what certain conflicts are and what threats they pose. And I think we're doing this over and over again. So at home, in our domestic circumstances, we are refusing to accept that Islamic terrorism is Islamic terrorism. Not because that means that we should do war if we accept that Muslims are being radicalized in Britain and Europe because of religious fanaticism, and that is Islamic terrorism. Not that we should make war on these people, but we should adopt some sort of condign, firm approach. And we don't want to do that because we don't want to get involved in all that for a whole range of reasons. So we redefine it. Because we don't want to face the consequences of having to deal with this, because we don't like what we would have to do to deal with this Islamic terrorism, we say it's not Islamic terrorism. It's not Islamic terrorism, no, it's something completely different. It's to do with disaffection, it's to do with alienation, it's to do with Islamophobia, it's to do with the fact that they're not educated. And if you're in the Obama administration, it's because they've got no jobs. So that's what we say about Islamic terrorism. We define it out of existence because we don't want to have to deal with it. Because if it's Islamic terrorism, we're going to have to take steps that we don't like taking. Abroad, we have redefined the Arab war against Israel. What is the Arab war against Israel? It's a war of extermination. What happens in a war of extermination? You defend the people who are being potentially exterminated against their exterminators. What does that mean? You have to defeat them in battle. Basically, someone's got to defeat them. We don't do war anymore, so we are very happy to have redefined for us the Arab war against Israel, a war of extermination, as a war, as a dispute, a conflict over territory, in which it's quite obvious that the territory should be divided up between the two equal sides, between the two sides which have a claim to the land, and it's not for us to decide who has the greater claim. It doesn't matter, it's not relevant. It doesn't matter who was there first, it doesn't matter who started this, it's irrelevant because it's so stupid to get involved in who started it. It's tit for tat, isn't it? If you get into this business of who actually started it, it's tit for tat. We are above all that. We know that basically heads have to be cracked together and they've got to divide the land. And so it follows, therefore, that people who want to exterminate other people are going to be given part of, or offered part of what the people who are the victims have in order to stop the extermination. I mean, this is what you call a category error, but this is where we get to, where we don't want to accept the nature of the threat because we don't want to have to take the action that would be needed to meet a non-negotiable agenda. And above all, at this present time of such danger to us, we cannot face the truth about Iran. By we, I mean Great Britain, and President Obama. We cannot face the truth about Iran because to do that, to face the truth about Iran, would, I'm afraid, mean military engagement. And so, because there is no way on earth that you can have any negotiation with fanatics who believe in a divinely ordained apocalypse. But in Britain, for example, because of the way of thinking that I'm describing, they're very frightened about Iran. They're really, really, really frightened about the Iranian issue. You know what they're frightened of? You think they're frightened in Britain that Iran's going to get the bomb? No. What are they frightened of in Britain? They're frightened that America or Israel may attack Iran. That's what frightens them. Because that's going to produce bad things. That's going to produce bad things. Because war produces bad things. We know war produces bad things. We can negotiate with the Iranians. We have decided they are moderate. Why are they moderate? Because we're going to negotiate with them. That's the way around it is. So that brings me to President Obama. So the most significant contribution to this change in the ordering of the world, I would suggest, is the attitude of the President of the United States. And that's because the most important country in the world is the United States, which has a historic role as being the policeman and the guarantor of peace and democracy and freedom in the world. Now, President Obama, for a start, embodies this liberal delusion I've been describing to you so far this evening. He embodies it, I would say, to the power of 10. So that's for starters. That's for starters. Now, in addition, he brings a lot of personal baggage, and I know that many of you may have views about precisely what personal baggage he brings, and we're not going to get into that particular argument this evening. But I think there are certain things which are fairly uncontestable about President Obama, given what he himself has said over time. He believes in, he seems to believe that the main reason why third world peoples are so enraged against the West and want to kill or destroy people in the West in the way that they do, that basically the main reason for that is because they have been so badly treated by the West in the past. And therefore it's not surprising that they are behaving in this way, and that if one wants therefore to stop them wanting to blow up people in the West and kill people in the West and do all these terrible things, then one has to remove the cause of their resentment and their anger. One has to remove America from its role as a world power which has interfered, in quotes, in foreign affairs and in foreign conflicts, because that is the cause of the problem. That is what has made them so very angry. So that is the first thing that's made them so angry. And therefore you have to stop America getting involved. His West Point speech, he made a speech at West Point quite recently, and he said he wasn't an isolationist, but America should not embark on military adventures without thinking through the consequences. Now, I actually happen to agree with that. I think that is a very sensible point of view. Personally, I think that America embarked on its military activities in both Iraq and Afghanistan without thinking through the consequences. But he arrived at a very different conclusion from me. He basically seems to be saying, therefore America shouldn't have got involved at all. I would say they should have got involved for the reasons that they did get involved, because they perceived rightly that these places were a threat to us unless they did get involved, but they should have done it smarter. The problem with their involvement was that it was so incredibly dumb, it was so badly thought through, it wasn't thought through at all, it was basically incompetent. And that was my quarrel with what America did in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's very different from what Obama was saying. He's saying we shouldn't get involved. When he says we shouldn't get involved without thinking of the consequences, he's basically thinking the consequences are that people are going to get killed, and therefore we shouldn't get involved. That seems to be what he's thinking. He seems to be reluctant ever to use military intervention, apart from a few drones here or there, or a few airstrikes. He says just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything is a nail. Well, look, that's also absolutely correct. But it seems that in his universe there are no nails at all. And I would suggest that the reason why Islamic State rose in Iraq in the way that it has done is not because they didn't have jobs. It is because President Obama withdrew from Iraq in the most disastrous way possible. He removed every soldier from Iraq and left it exposed and vulnerable precisely to precisely the kind of advance made by Islamic State. So, President Obama is personally responsible for the rise of Islamic State. Now, he believes, as I've already alluded to before, he believes that by extending the hand of friendship to Iran, you bring them in from the cold, because he believes, you start with the premise that the cause of these people's rage, these people's murderous rage, is what America has done to them, then it follows that if America stops doing it to them and says, okay guys, we're now going to be friendly to you, these Iranians are going to say, oh, right, okay, we'll sort of stop being the world's greatest exporter of terrorism, and we'll stop pursuing our nuclear weapon in order to commit genocide against Israel. Of course, the situation has now changed with this hand of friendship. And so we will basically become civilized people and be friendly with America and the West. This, of course, is delusional, in my view. President Obama also seems to think that he can actually produce world peace by producing a kind of balance of terror. So you have, for example, Saudi Arabia, bad thing, exporting Islamic extremism and worse to the West. And so Saudi Arabia has to be contained. How do you contain Saudi Arabia? Well, you elevate another set of really, really, really bad people, and then they can basically sort of hold the balance of power against each other because they both hate each other, they both want to kill each other, and then you get world peace. Question: since both of them want to basically just kill and destroy the West, where does that leave us? Answer: in the mess. And that's clearly, or not clearly, that's in my view where we have got to. So Iran is a disastrous policy in which, as far as I can see, President Obama is intent on a situation in which there has to be a deal. There has to be a deal. And it doesn't matter if it's a bad deal, there has to be a deal, and then you can say there's a deal, and Iran has agreed to suspend whatever it's doing, but it hasn't. The interim deal made already with Iran has already crossed the West's red line, the red line having been that we will never allow Iran to continue to enrich, enrich uranium, and the interim deal explicitly or implicitly accepts that it will continue to enrich uranium. In other words, it will get to the bomb, but more slowly. So this is the way that negotiation is going, and that is, of course, why Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming to alert the world to this situation when he makes his controversial visit to Congress, at Congress's Speaker Biden's invitation. This is why also President Obama and other Western leaders made this terrible mistake over the Arab Spring. In the Arab Spring, President Obama backed the Muslim Brotherhood because he thought the Muslim Brotherhood were the kind of Islamic fanatics, and of course we can't call them Islamic, we must just call them fanatics, with whom we could do business. Why? Because some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood in some countries weren't necessarily involved in or calling for violence, and therefore they were our kind of non-Islamic extremists. But in fact, what we saw was that the Egyptians themselves, in Egypt, where Muslim Brotherhood came to power, the Egyptians themselves threw them out because the Egyptians themselves weren't prepared to suffer under the yoke of Islamist fanaticism in their own country. Basically, in Egypt and in Libya, what you have is a situation where President Obama and Prime Minister Cameron in Britain and other Western leaders had a situation where you had really bad people. President Mubarak of Egypt, you had Gaddafi in Libya. Bad people, we wouldn't give them the time of day. They were not exactly Democrats, they were against freedom. And they weren't terribly good for us, but nevertheless they were kind of in our pockets, and we replaced them by people who were really, really bad people who also wanted to destroy us. And that was considered progress. It was one of these incredibly stupid things. So the West really is all over the place in the Arab, as far as the Arab world is concerned. You have President Obama dismissing Islamic State, first of all, as JVs, then later, as it was bombed, confessed that he had no strategy at all with which to confront it. The fact that Iran is fighting Islamic State in Iraq seems to be driving all before it. It denies it, it's in alliance with Iran, but nevertheless America is in a de facto alliance with Iran. Because Iran is fighting Islamic State in Iraq, the American administration, the Obama administration, basically is treating Iran as a kind of ally. The State Department even suggested that the United States would side with the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, who overturned the government of Yemen and produced an Islamist government in Yemen, because over Islamic State, Iran and the West were on the same side. And as I've said, we are shaping up to a really terrible nuclear deal with Iran, which will put all of us at even greater risk. Now, all this is utter madness, this business over Iran fighting Islamic State, and therefore it's our kind of ally. Because in the Middle East, as in elsewhere, but in the Middle East, my enemy's enemy may nevertheless still be my mortal enemy. Iran has killed countless American personnel in Iraq and elsewhere. It's been responsible for attack after attack on American and Western interests over the years. It remains in a state of self-declared war against America and the West. It remains still the most deadly threat against the West in the world. In Iraq, it's fighting Islamic State with a view to defeating the US in Iraq. It is going to take over Iraq and thus defeat the whole purpose of the United States being in Iraq. So how stupid is it to see it as an ally in Iraq simply because it's against Islamic State? My enemy's enemy may still be my mortal enemies, and yet President Obama is treating it as an ally. It is no wonder that Senator Menendez, the senior Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, told the Senate hearing, quote, "The more I hear from the administration and its quotes, the more it sounds like talking points that come straight out of Tehran." And the final thing that President Obama's policy of withdrawing America from its historic role of being the policeman of democracy and freedom in the world is that the world's actors have seen exactly what's happening, have understood what's happening, and have acted accordingly, because President Obama has created a kind of vacuum, and the bad people have filled that vacuum. That is why President Putin is marching around with apparent impunity, threatening to resurrect his Russian empire. That is why China is rising in the east, and that is why Iran has become the regional behemoth that it has become, because President Obama has taken America away from its historic role. And everyone can see, therefore, that the West is basically impotent. And of course, that's not even getting into the hostility that President Obama has shown towards Israel. In other words, what President Obama has done is supported or empowered the enemies of the West while dumping on the West's own allies. Now, why does President Obama behave like this? Well, in Britain, people who were very keen to see President Obama in the White House thought he was great because he's very European in his thinking, he's very liberal in his thinking, and he has a kind of way of looking at the world which accords with the progressive European mind. So in Britain, they've always cut him a great deal of slack, President Obama, and they can see the complete mess he's made of virtually everything in the world of foreign affairs. And therefore, they're very charitable in Britain. They think he's just completely and utterly clueless. They think he is an absolute idiot. They think, what a chump. What a chump. He hasn't got a clue. He's just incompetent. Because that's how the British think. They think that their leaders are incompetent. They never think they're evil. They think they're just stupid. So, he's clueless. Well, I don't think he's clueless at all. I think he is enacting a strategy with which he came to power. He came to power, as far as I could see, determined to increase the role of the state at home in America and diminish the role of the United States abroad as the policeman of freedom and democracy. And he's carried that out, I think, pretty well to the letter. As I said, I think he believes that American exceptionalism is not the potential salvation of freedom and democracy in the world. I think he thinks that American exceptionalism is the cause of the problems in the world because he identifies American exceptionalism with cultural imperialism. And so allies such as Britain or Israel, he's made it quite clear, can no longer expect United States support which is better directed to addressing inequality at home. It was once the belief in America that the spread of democracy and free markets abroad was the best guarantee of security at home. But as I've said before, I think President Obama believes in evening up the score between the West and the rest. He believes that the United States has enslaved half the world. He believes that Iran, that Hamas, and Russia were all demonized by President Bush and therefore kind of victims of America. And he has this left-wing mindset that I was referring to earlier. Conflict is bad. All analysis of world affairs has to fit that template. And this is a kind of utopian and very unrealistic position. For example, and he's borne this out by what he has said in a recent interview, he suggested that a nuclear agreement with Iran would help Iran become, quote, a very successful regional power that was also abiding by international laws and international rules. What sort of planet is he living on? I mean, this is Iran we are talking about. He believes that those who use military force are destined for the ash can of history because force is inherently counterproductive. And so he thinks, for example, that Islamic State, just like other terrorist organizations, will be defeated. Why will they be defeated? How will they be defeated? They'll be defeated because they, quote, don't have a vision that appeals to ordinary people. That's why ISIS is going to be defeated, because the ordinary people of Syria and Iraq are going to say one day, you know what, we think ISIS really stinks as an administration, we're going to vote them out. And he dismisses Russia in similar terms. Quote, the days in which conquest of land somehow was a formula for great nation status is over. Someone kindly tell President Putin that? The days in which conquest of land was a formula for great nation status is over. In President Obama's universe, that may well be the case. But in Vladimir Putin's universe, it is the opposite of the case. So, again, what sort of planet is he living on? And as far as Israel is concerned, well, Israel just gets in the way of the narrative, doesn't it? It gets in the way of the narrative. The narrative is everything is negotiable. There is no non-negotiable agenda. Every conflict can be solved by a peace process and by negotiation. So, and also the narrative of evening up. You have to even up the balance between the oppressed developing world and the oppressive free world. Israel gets in the way of all this stuff, doesn't it? So therefore, because Israel gets in the way, you have to deny what Israel is up against. You deny that Iran has an agenda of genocide. Instead, you say President Rouhani is a great reforming Iranian. You just deny it. You deny that Iran is still committed to the extinction of the Jewish state. And you also deny Islamic terrorism. And you say stuff like the slaughter of the Jews in the kosher supermarket in Paris, it was a random act. A random act. Because anything else would get in the way of the narrative. The narrative is, there is no non-negotiable agenda. So what we're seeing is not just a knockdown fight with Israel. We are watching, I would suggest, the destruction of America's role as historic role, as guarantor and protector of the free world. And I'm afraid to say, America's translation instead into the facilitator of Islamic terror and war. We've seen the rise of the Iranian empire. We've seen the coup in Yemen, bringing an Iranian-backed Shiite group to power there. In Iraq, where Iran is fighting the Islamic State, Shiite militias responsible in the past for killing United States forces, those militias are now giving orders to the Iraqi army under the oversight of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force. Iraq is on the way to becoming an Iranian satrapy. That is the effect of the Obama doctrine. And we see this extraordinary reordering of alliances. We now have an alliance, tacit it may be, but an alliance between Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Israel, get your head around that one, versus an alliance between the United States, Iran, and Qatar, the funders of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now that is a terrifying and terrible state of affairs, and that is the reordering of the world that we have witnessed under the Obama presidency. So my final point is this, or my final question is this: given all I've said, can Europe and the West be saved? Well, Europe and the West are slightly different. Europe is slightly different from America, obviously, and Britain is different again from Europe, but you know what I mean. Can Europe and the West be saved? Well, the The question then is, will Western civilization basically walk off the edge of the cliff where it now is, or will it pull back and will it fight to defend what it stands for? Well, the short answer to that is, who knows? I certainly don't. But I would just make the following points. What I've tried to sketch out very briefly this evening is that we see a new world order becoming a kind of war of all against all. We see in the Middle East, in the Arab and Muslim world, we see authoritarian, hyper-nationalist, tribal enclaves, organizations, versus in the West, what has become a post-democratic world, a world in which the nation has been eroded. A post-democratic world. In this post-democratic world, in Europe in particular, the people are not very happy about it being a post-democratic world. They are not happy about the fact that they don't have a sense of nationhood anymore, that that's been kind of outsourced to the European Union and all these transnational institutions. They're not happy about that. Amazing to report, the peoples of Europe actually rather like self-government. They rather like the idea that a nation is where they can express their culture and their values through something called laws, enacted by something called parliaments, which are voted in by them and can be voted out by them. They're rather attached to that idea. So they're pretty cheesed off by the idea that their democracy is going down the pan. And they're even more cheesed off by the fact that there's, among the political elite, left and right, there's nobody who's actually going to take this on. There's nobody who's going to address this. They're even more cheesed off by the fact that we're all supposed to say it's very, very racist to object to mass immigration. It's very, very racist to say that you should be able to have your own culture in your own country. The only acceptable position is to be multicultural, and therefore you shouldn't object to mass immigration because basically the peoples of the world have every right to come and live in your country, and you shouldn't object. And if you object, you are a racist of some kind or another. And amazing to report, the peoples of Europe really, really don't like that. They actually do want to be part of a culture that they can feel a sense of shared bonds with, otherwise called a nation. And so what we're having in Europe is a kind of revolt of the people. The political establishment won't have any of this. They are sold on the idea that the nation is the problem. They're sold on the idea of transnational institutions and laws. They're sold on the idea there has to be a free movement of peoples in Europe, a kind of brotherhood of man approach. Otherwise it's racist, multiculturalism, they're sold on that. And so there's a rise of extremist parties in Europe. I say extremist in quotes because some of them are not very extreme. Some of them just believe in democracy and in the nation. And some of them are more extreme. Some of them are truly racist. And some of them are even worse than racist. Some of them are kind of neo-fascist. They're all lumped together by progressives as being all beyond the pale. But because the political establishment has basically abandoned the people in their desire for self-government and having a shared sense of nationhood, increasingly the peoples of Europe are voting for these parties. So there is a kind of revolt going on. And so you have a situation in which in the West you have this erosion of the idea of the nation and this erosion of the idea of democracy, which is a terrifying thing to me. And on the other hand, so you have the erosion of the idea of the nation, and as a result of which you have these two great behemoths, Russia and China, now seeing the opportunity that's presenting to themselves. They see a new world order based on the idea of pre-modern spheres of influence, before the nation-state was invented. They see the nation-state being eroded, they see democracy being eroded in Europe. They see their opportunity to seize power, to seize land, So Russia is, as we can see, Vladimir Putin is trying to seize what was the old Russian Empire. We see China extending its influence into Africa, into the Middle East, because it can see that by getting involved in all these countries, it extends its influence, and it kind of resurrects a kind of Chinese empire. And these two countries, China and Russia, I think, are looking at the world and saying, you know what, because the West is disintegrating, it doesn't know what it believes in anymore, it doesn't believe in the nation, it's not prepared to fight, defend itself as a nation, democracy is over. This is our opportunity to recreate our empires and seize control of the world in this way. So you have the rise of empires on the one hand, and in the East, in the Muslim and Arab world, you have the rise of tribes, or the rediscovery the institution of tribalism instead of the nation, and a war between tribes and within tribes. As the Yale professor Charles Hill has said, we are moving back from states to empires. We're moving back to before 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, which introduced the idea of the nation-state. And so, in my view, European isolationism is wrapped up with this decline in the idea of the nation, and President Obama is in much the same mold in the ways that I suggested. But I think even more troubling to me, coming here as a visitor and looking at this country and at the concerns being expressed, it seems to me that the problem is not simply President Obama. When you look at the Republican Party, I'm not sure what they stand for anymore. They're showing also a degree of uncertainty over a whole range of stuff. What are they for anymore? What are they defending? What are they against? Are they isolationist or are they interventionist? If they're interventionist, if they're not isolationist, if they do believe in America as the exceptional nation, if they're interventionist and they believe in America rediscovering its role as the protector of the free world, if they're interventionist, what are they trying to achieve? I mean, American idealism is based on the idea that the world is one where reason and freedom are kind of givens, where democratic institutions and free markets follow naturally. In other words, American exception is based on the idea that there is a kind of Western given, a given of Western ideals of nation and democracy. But as I've said, in the West, these ideals of nation and democracy are disintegrating. So what is America going to exceptionally be promoting? Now, some people think that democracy is on its last legs. Some people think that the nations of Europe are looking instead to a future in which they are destined to become rather like Singapore, authoritarian countries. And you have, as I've said before, a terminal alienation of the European public from the democratic process. The old divisions between left and right over state control and the market have largely broken down. They've been replaced by ideologies, isms, multiculturalism, materialism, feminism, environmentalism, which are all basically deeply illiberal. All these ideologies are illiberal. They brook no dissent because they all embody the virtuous idea of the improvement of humanity, so you can't dissent from them. If you dissent from them, you're a really bad person. So because they brook no dissent, they're basically anti-freedom. They demonize their opponents, and they're also inimical to reason, because these are ideas that brook no challenge. If there are any facts which are inconvenient to these ideas, any evidence which may suggest these ideas are basically wrong, that can't be. The idea cannot be wrong. The idea is intrinsically the embodiment of good. And so what's wrong, therefore, are the facts. What's wrong is the evidence. And any evidence that stands against these ideologies must be ruled out of the court. It cannot have any traction whatsoever. It cannot have any kind of substance whatsoever. And so the advance of ideologies, all these isms that have governed our lives for so long now, are inimical to reason, because ideologies drive out truth and evidence. They start with a conclusion, they start with an idea, and they force the evidence to fit. So, in my conclusion, I would say this. What I've tried to explain this evening is this. Having undermined our societies at home in the way that I very briefly sketched out, I think we are unprepared for the way the world is now convulsing. We have a progressive replacement of the nation in both East and West. We have the rise of tribes, we have the rise of empires. We have the withdrawal of the United States from historic role policing freedom and democracy, enabling countries that are inimical to freedom and democracy, notably Russia, China, and Iran, to move in to fill the vacuum. I think only if we rediscover and reaffirm the unique value of our Western society and culture, and are prepared robustly to defend it, and equally important, to be seen robustly to defend it, and only also if America rediscovers its historic role as defender of the West, as defender of freedom and democracy, will we really be able to defend the values that we all hold dear. Thank you very much.
For several questions, and Ms. Siva is going to moderate the questions.
I just did one.
Thank you very much. It was an amazing talk. Left us, at least me, a little bit depressed, but okay, such is life. To the picture, have not mentioned, Obama is seemingly connecting with Iran. This morning, we heard Israeli media. The head of Hezbollah has also come out against the ISIS. The only difference is he's saying that all the Muslims should unite and not expect the West to come and fight for them. I'm curious, I mean, I don't know that you would have the answer, how Obama will react to that. Will he offer a hand to Hezbollah too?
I would think that it's not unlikely that he would offer a hand to Hezbollah on the basis that they will be very helpful in opposing ISIS. And this is the way in which, the Islamist world, the Islamists are basically taking the West as suckers. I mean, they are. It's so incredibly stupid, but that is the inescapable conclusion. If you think that Iran is your ally because you're against ISIS, then anyone who's against ISIS becomes the West's ally. It doesn't that follow? So I don't know how President Obama would react to Hezbollah. That may be a step too far. On the other hand, Hezbollah is Iran. So what's not to like? What's not to like? You're embracing the snake. Why not embrace, the smaller snake?
What would you expect from Hillary if elected in terms of foreign policy and carrying on?
I would expect some differences in emphasis, but I just think of that 3 a.m. phone call over Benghazi, and I think that Hillary will do whatever it takes to carry on being in power. And in other words, it will be wholly driven by political self-interest. I don't think she has, if she has a fully formed view of the world and the West and how to defend freedom and all that sort of stuff, whether it's from the left or the right, I haven't seen it. I mean, I just haven't seen a coherent position. She used to be very enamored of the Palestinians, and then she became a New York senator, and she became less enamored of the Palestinians. So which is the true Hillary? I really don't know, and I really don't want to find out.
It was an amazing, amazing speech. Absolutely wonderful. It really enlightened me. Saying it like it is. What's going to happen in Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians? Where do you see that going?
What's going to happen in Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians? Realistically, where is it going? It's going absolutely nowhere. Israel is, whatever it is they say in public, Israel has long, I think, taken the view that it's going nowhere, and it's never going to go anywhere unless someone breaks the logjam by redefining the problem. As long as the free, so-called civilized world continues to misrepresent the problem to itself, and as long as it continues to encourage and incentivize war against Israel by giving the Palestinians a free pass, then this stalemate is going to continue, and Israel is going to hunker down as it's hunkered down for years, firefighting, trying to protect itself as best it can, trying to outwit its enemies in the State Department as best it can, trying to outwit Obama as best it can, and hoping that something turns up. And that's, I'm afraid, for the foreseeable future, how it's going to go. What's needed is for someone to come and tell the truth around there. What's needed is for someone to stand up and say, what is this nonsense? This is a war of extermination against Israel. Why on earth should anyone, the civilized world, ever expect people who are the victims of potential extermination to have to make any compromises ever to the people who are trying to exterminate them? And if you do that, I don't see anyone doing that anytime soon. Without that, this thing is going to continue as it is, because the reason why the Middle East impasse is the impasse that is never resolved, unlike other conflicts in the world, is because, as far as I can see, pretty well uniquely in the world, it is the conflict where people who are bent on exterminating another people are given a free pass, whereas the people who are the victims of that, potential victims of that extermination, are dumped on and blamed for defending themselves. And if you do that, it's not rocket science. You incentivize the people who are committing the violence, who are trying to exterminate Israel. You incentivize them to carry on until the job is finished. It's so obvious. So unless that's changed, then this awful situation, I'm afraid, will continue.
Okay, this is the last bill. This is, even though we have so many questions, we apologize, we can't get to all of them. We'll make this the last question.
What I don't understand, thank you. What I don't understand is the average person in Britain, in France, in Germany, all across the world, they see the horrors of Islamic State. They see the instability of the Arab world, and they're siding against the only stable country in the Middle East. And I just don't understand how rational people can take that position. Do you have an idea on that, or why they would do that?
Well, it is baffling, because as you say, it's completely nuts. I think there are a number of explanations, or a number of reasons, one of which is that the Arab world, to be more precise, the Arabs under the Palestinians under Yasser Arafat, constructed a most brilliant strategy. Basically, it's psychological warfare, you might call it, but it's basically a propaganda strategy, which he cooked up with the Soviet Union, who are past masters of this. It's a Cold War strategy. It involves mind-bending. It involves reversing truth and lies. It involves really rewriting of history. And it was carried out to the letter, and it wasn't recognized as the threat that it actually was. I mean, this strategy has been in place for 4 decades. It had an enormous amount of money behind it. It was not really opposed or countered. And as a result, it captured the intelligentsia and it rewrote history, it rewrote facts on the ground. So that's a very important reason why Israel is seen in this way, because the whole thing has shifted. I mean, people in Britain, even people who actually are quite sympathetic to Israel, they basically think that Israel is only the Jewish state because of misplaced, of a sense of guilt that the Europeans had after the Holocaust, as a result of which European Jews were plucked out of Europe and placed in a country with which they had no connection, where they drove out the indigenous population, the Palestinian Muslims who've been there since time immemorial. Now that's what most people in Britain think. Okay, even people who are quite well disposed towards Israel, because they think we should be nice to them because they did have a Holocaust. With that level of not just ignorance, but a complete reversal of the truth, it's not surprising that people have the view that they have. But I think it's also to do with what I was trying to say earlier. That the point about Israel is that it is up against a non-negotiable agenda, and that does require something other than peace processes to deal with. And people really don't want to go down that road. That's another explanation. And the other explanation is that in the West, people are just sort of sick of the Jews. They really have had enough of them. And they just wish Israel would just go away. Because if Israel went away, then everything would be okay, wouldn't it? That's how they think.
Sorry.
A final message.